You can pretty much guarantee if Sigma has an APS-C lens at any given focal length, then Viltrox and TTArtisan are going to have a very similar lens at a much lower price point. And both of those companies have already done this at the 56 and 35mm focal lengths, and now Viltrox has released a 25mm lens, and TTArtisan has released a 23mm lens, both of which directly compete against Sigma's 23mm f1.4. The Sigma lens is the most recent release in their series of f1.4 lenses, and I think this is the most optically perfect lens in that lineup, which means it will pose the biggest challenge to the Viltrox and the TTArtisan's lenses, but it's also Sigma's most expensive lens in that lineup. So there's even more incentive for budget-conscious buyers to look at these more affordable lenses. And the TTArtisan is only 20% of the price of the Sigma, and the Viltrox is 30% of the price. So you can buy a 3-lens set of the Viltrox or TTArtisan, including a 23 or 25, a 35, and a 56 for significantly less than one of the Sigma 23mm f1.4 lenses. There will be links in the description down below to the best prices I could find on all of these lenses, including the Sigma, which is currently on sale. And you can also see which camera mounts the lenses are available on, because at the time of shooting this video, they're not all available on all the mounts, but I do know there are more coming. There will also be links to all the gear that I use to produce this video, my A cam, my B cam, even my computer and editing headphones. Everything I use to make these videos will be listed down in the description below. I bought the Sigma lens with my own money, but the Viltrox and the TTArtisan lenses were given to me, but this video is not sponsored and I have not been paid by anyone to make this video. When we look at this 23mm focal length on an APS-C sensor camera, this is a 35mm full frame field of view equivalent. This is generally considered the best all-purpose universal focal length, and if you could only have one focal length on any given camera, this might be it. And as an example, the very popular Fujifilm X100 VI comes with a fixed 23mm lens on it. Now, this is an APS-C sensor camera as well, so you're getting a 35mm full frame field of view equivalent. And that's because this is such a good lens for such a wide variety of things. And first of all, this is like the default focal length for street photography and travel. This is because it's wide enough to set the scene and take a photo of a person or an object and demonstrate the environment that they're in, but it's also not too wide in which you get a significant amount of distortion, which can make your image look unnatural. Used in the correct distance from a subject, it also is a very useful environmental portrait lens, which won't distort the features or proportions of your subject as long as you don't get too close to them. All of these lenses have a quite wide maximum aperture, meaning that's going to allow a lot of light in. This is going to make them excellent in low light conditions, which means you're going to get cleaner images at night or in indoor environments where you don't have a lot of light. And when compared to a standard kit lens, these lenses are going to allow anywhere between 400 and 600% more light. This is going to give you significantly cleaner images and allow you to take better quality photos in situations that you just couldn't with a kit lens. This is also going to allow you to blur out the background and isolate a subject in a way that you can't do with a standard kit lens either. So when people ask me what is the first lens they should buy after the kit lens, it's almost always a large maximum aperture fixed focal length lens. And we got two different focal lengths we're dealing with here. The Sigma and the TTArtisan are 23mm lenses, and the Viltrox is a 25mm lens. And roughly the focal length of the lens, which is what those numbers represent, equals the field of view, or represents the field of view that you're going to see when you're looking through your camera and how wide your camera sees. And the bigger that number, the more zoomed in it is, and the smaller the number, the wider it is. But that doesn't always hold perfectly true. And when we look at the field of view on these three different lenses, the Sigma actually has noticeably the widest at 23mm. Then when we get to the TTArtisan, even though it's also a 23mm lens, it is zoomed in almost as much as the 25mm Viltrox and looks more like a 24mm lens. So even though the TTArtisan and the Sigma have the same focal length, you don't actually get the same field of view. Just something to note. Having a look at the optical performance of the three lenses, the Viltrox exhibits a very minor amount of barrel distortion, nothing that I would be too concerned about. The Sigma actually has the most distortion, and I would consider its barrel distortion moderate or sort of middle of the road. And the TTArtisan has a very minor mustache pattern, which has a little bit of a dip in the middle and comes back up, but overall it's so well corrected that this is very, very hard to notice. Now, if you're editing these raw photos in Lightroom, they will auto correct. correct, and there's correction profiles for all the lenses in Lightroom. In addition to that, some of these lenses will correct in camera with some camera systems. So depending on what camera or camera system you're using, you will get distortion correction in camera. Moving on to Vignette, first we're going to look at them all wide open. They all have different maximum apertures, so this isn't going to be quite a fair comparison, but I wanted to give a starting point. The Sigma and the TTArtisan have the most wide open, but keep in mind the Sigma is shooting at f1.4, where the TTArtisan is shooting at f1.8, and the Viltrox seems to have the least. Once we stop it down to f2, we see the Sigma has the least, the Viltrox isn't far behind, and the TTArtisan is still very strong. It still has heavy Vignette. Stopping down to f2.8, the Vignette has reduced a lot more on all of them, but the TTArtisan is still very strong. And at f4 and beyond, the Sigma and the Viltrox are looking really clean and pretty much identical, and the TTArtisan Vignette remains noticeable all the way up to f8, so it never really goes away. Vignette tends to be an optical test that we do with the idea that less Vignette is better, but I add Vignette to most of my photos anyway, so you might actually prefer photos that have Vignette. So I've just thrown some examples of the TTArtisan up on screen now because it had the strongest Vignette. And Vignette is also easily added or subtracted in editing. So I don't think this performance is a deal breaker for any of them. But if you tend to add Vignette to your photos anyways, or like the look of the images with Vignette, then actually getting that look straight out of camera with the TTArtisan might actually be an advantage rather than an optical flaw. But this is completely personal preference. I did expect to find some chromatic aberration with these lenses, but despite my best effort, I really couldn't find much. I had one shot with the TTArtisan. If you zoomed into about 500%, maybe there was the slightest amount of purple cast or fringing. I also had one random photo with the Sigma that when I zoomed into about 800% and looked at some backlit branches in a slightly out of focus area, there was some purple fringing. But in real world results, in all of the photos I've taken, there's nothing that I would even consider relevant when making a purchase decision about these lenses. And I think the performance is pretty clinical. The same thing with longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is a change in color cast before and after the plane of focus. Even shooting across test charts in a close focus situation, I couldn't see any meaningful longitudinal chromatic aberration. Once again, a pretty clinical performance. Looking at the flare performance, and this is where we saw some quite significant differences. The Sigma controls the flare the best. The Viltrox wasn't far behind though, and in fact, in a lot of situations, you couldn't even tell the difference between the Sigma and the Viltrox. The TTArtisan clearly shows the most flare, and while this is far from a clinical performance, it's actually similar to a lot of very popular cinema lenses, and you will see these radiating rainbow flares in many of your favorite movies and TV shows. So if you're after a clinical flare performance, the Viltrox and the Sigma are clearly the best, but there's also a wide range of situations where the TTArtisan performance either has no impact on image quality, or in some situations adds a stylized character to your images. So particularly taking into account the price point of this lens, it wouldn't stop me from buying it just because it flares more than the other two. You can still capture beautiful images with it, even in situations which are prone to lens flare. And in some situations, it might actually add some character and interest that may even improve your overall image. Sunstars is one I generally don't talk about, but I did take some long exposure photos and captured a few images with Sunstars. And while I think the Sigma Sunstars were the most well defined, I actually prefer the look of the Sunstars out of the TTArtisan, but you can get cool Sunstar effects out of any of these lenses. Looking at close-up image quality, all these lenses are acceptably sharp at their minimum focus distance, with the Sigma getting the closest and giving you the maximum magnification. The TTArtisan isn't too far behind, and the Viltrox has the least magnification of the three. Interestingly, at the minimum focus distance, the TTArtisan exhibits this crazy focus fall off at the corners of the frame, which is definitely an optical flaw, but it's also kind of interesting. And I think it's valuable to have lenses that have a close minimum focus distance, particularly when they're all-purpose travel lenses, because you might be out with friends and family and taking pictures in the environment or people or environmental portraits. But if you're having a meal or you're seeing something interesting that's small, you can get close to it and capture those details in a scene. So I do think it's important that all these lenses perform well in close focus situations, and they all do that reasonably well, with the Sigma obviously being the best. The quality of the bokeh and background blur on these lenses was very interesting. Generally, when I have compared cheaper lenses to more expensive lenses in the past, I've found that the more expensive lenses are sharper, but the background blur is often busy and less pleasing. With these lenses, I struggled to tell the difference with the background blur or the bokeh in any of them, and they were all very, very similar, forming a nice soft backdrop to whatever you had in focus in the frame, and with a nice transition from in focus to out of focus areas. Looking at the specular highlights, the Sigma and the Viltrox were once again very similar, with lemon shapes as you get close to the edge of frame. And the TTArtisan exhibited a slight amount of swirly bokeh effect, which I think you could accentuate in the right situation. It also had a slight bubble bokeh effect, which I really liked. When I compare the sharpness and detail performance of these three lenses, this was probably the biggest surprise of this entire series of tests. And that's because I expected the Sigma to just blow the other two away, but it was far closer than I really expected. And to start with, when we have them all wide open, keep in mind that they're not all shooting at the same aperture wide open. The Viltrox was the sharpest, followed by the Sigma and the TTArtisan. But this isn't an exactly fair comparison because the Sigma is shooting at f1.4 and the Viltrox is shooting at f1.7. Once we stop them down to f2, now we've got a very even playing field, and the Sigma and the Viltrox are almost identical, very, very similar, and the TTArtisan is not very far behind. At f2.8, the Viltrox and the Sigma, once again, still very similar. TTArtisan just a little bit behind, but I think the TTArtisan is sharp enough that in real world results, you're actually not going to pick them apart. And once we are at f4 on, they are all pretty well identical in the center of frame. Now we move to the edge of frame, and I actually think the edge of frame is an underrated sharpness test, and I actually think it's more important than corner sharpness because regardless of what lens you're using, you rarely put the thing that you want the viewer to look at in the corner of frame. But if you got a group photo or something like that, it's quite common to have somebody very close to the edge of frame. So shooting wide open, the Viltrox and the Sigma, once again, almost identical, but the TTArtisan was noticeably softer at the edge of frame. Once again, Sigma's at f1.4 and the Viltrox is f1.7. Once we stop it down to f2, I think the Sigma is clearly sharpest at the edge of frame, then the Viltrox, then the TT. The same order at f2.8. Once we get to f4, they are all very close now. Maybe the Sigma is a hair better, but no difference that you would really tell in real world results comparing all these three lenses. And in f5.6 to f8 and on, I really couldn't tell any difference. Once we move to the corners and we're shooting wide open, the Viltrox and the Sigma were basically the same. The TTArtisan was extremely soft in the corner. Stopping down to f2 to get us on an even playing field. Now we've got the Sigma, then the Viltrox, then the TT. Sigma is clearly sharpest in the corner. At f2, we've got the same order, Sigma, Viltrox, TT. And at f4, once again, the same order. As we continue to stop it down, both the Sigma and the Viltrox get very, very sharp, and at f5.6, they're pretty well identical to each other, but the TTArtisan doesn't really sharpen up till around f8. And this is just an image character that we get out of this TT lens. I'm just going to touch on the autofocus performance really quickly, and keep in mind all this testing was done on my Fujifilm X-H2. Also, the Viltrox has not been released to the public yet, and the TTArtisan is quite a new lens, so we might see firmware updates in the future that actually change this performance. When we look at the photography side of it, the Sigma was clearly the fastest, and it never hunted, never pulsed. It was super confident, and it was spot on every time. The Viltrox and the TTArtisan were slightly slower, but they didn't pulse or hunt, and they didn't miss focus. They just weren't as fast as the Sigma. The Sigma will likely be better for faster moving subjects because it was noticeably faster when autofocusing in photography. And in testing the video autofocus performance, the Sigma was definitely the most confident, and it never pulsed or hunted. And it moved very smoothly from different subjects that it was focusing on. The Viltrox and the TTArtisan had similar smooth focus pulls, but on some occasions it would overshoot the focus point. So you would point at an object, it would find it, it would go beyond it, and it would pull back. Now, this didn't happen all the time, but it happened enough that it was definitely noticeable. So the Sigma autofocus performance for video was not only like faster and more confident, but there was absolutely no pulsing. Now, importantly, In both photo and video, the autofocus performance of the TTArtisan and the Viltrox was superior to a lot of older Fujifilm made lenses like the 35 f1.4 and the 27mm f2.8, and those lenses cost hundreds of dollars more. So if you have been using any of those older Fujifilm lenses, you can know that the autofocus performance on these new third-party lenses will be better. The Viltrox is the only one of the 3 lenses that I have on the Sony system, and you'll see here it still does that thing where it goes slightly beyond the plane of focus and then comes back, just a little bit of a pulse at the end. But overall, it is a more confident performance on the Sony system because of the better autofocus algorithm. Having a look at the build quality on these 3 lenses, the Sigma is noticeably the best. It's also the biggest and the heaviest. I think that comes with just being an f1.4 lens. It also does have a rubber sealing gasket, which is different than the other 2. It has a nice polished metal lens mount, and it just is a very nice feeling premium lens. Definitely feels the best of the 2. I would say even though the TTArtisan is the cheapest, it probably has the second best build quality because you've got an all metal body. Once again, a polished metal lens mount. It is significantly smaller than the Sigma, as you can see, and it is significantly lighter. But then when we bring in the Viltrox is a plastic body, and because of that, it feels cheaper. It does feel more like a Nifty 50 or one of the major manufacturers like entry-level cheap kit lenses, but it's also significantly lighter, and it is the smallest. So I think that's also an advantage, and Viltrox is calling this line of lenses their Air lenses. The other thing you'll notice on the Viltrox is it does have a USB-C port for updating the firmware. And the firmware update process on the Viltrox is you just plug it into your computer. It shows up as a drive, and then you drag and drop the firmware update onto the lens. The lens sort of reboots, and all of a sudden it's got the firmware updated. It's a very simple process, and it works on both PC and Mac, which is important when I get to the other 2. When we look at the Sigma, you'll see it doesn't have any USB-C port. You actually take the file, the update firmware file, you drop it on an SD card, you put it into your camera, and the camera updates the firmware. It's a little bit more of a cumbersome process, but not a problem, and also can work on Mac or PC or any other operating system that you can drag a file onto an SD card with. You'll notice the TTArtisan does not have a USB-C port. That's because it comes with a rear lens cap that has a USB-C port built into it, and you put that on and you plug it in, and just like the Viltrox, it shows up as a drive on the computer, and then you drag and drop the file on it. The one difference is that this update process on the TTArtisan only works on PC and not Mac, which I think is a problem for a lot of people. Now, keep in mind that firmware updates on lenses don't happen that often. I mean, you might, the beginning, have one every 6 months or something like that, but then long term, after 18 months, there might never be a firmware update again. So you would just have to find a PC when you did update the firmware. So maybe not a deal breaker, but for some people that might be a deal breaker. I know that's a lot of information, but which lens should you buy? Well, to start with, let's have a look at the TTArtisan. It is the cheapest, and significantly so. It has good autofocus performance in photo. It's a little imperfect in video, but I think it's still usable, and it is still better than a number of Fuji's own older lenses. So it's not a complete deal breaker, particularly if you're primarily doing photo. The build is great. It is an all-metal build, but it's still a reasonably small and lightweight lens, and I would say that the build quality in this lens is far above the price point. Like what you're getting per dollar in build quality, this is by far the best lens. The flare performance on the lens is imperfect, and it will affect some images, but not all images. And I think what I found in using it, it did make some images worse, but I found it made some images better. But this is really going to be about your personal feelings about flare. If you don't mind some interesting radiating rainbow flares, or you think that looks cool, then you might actually prefer what this lens does over the other ones. If you want a clinical flare performance, then this is absolutely not going to be the lens for you. The other thing about this lens is because it has heavy vignette and because it has softness in the corners, these are definitely optical flaws, but the images have a look to them. They have an interesting sort of organic look, which I think leans into that sort of nowadays people going back to film and Fujifilm film simulations. So I think for somebody who likes to shoot vintage lenses, like manual focus lenses like I talk about on this channel, somebody who wants a straight out of camera look, this lens definitely gives you more of a look than any of the lenses in the lineup. And while those are optical imperfections, it does make the images coming out of this lens very interesting. The next one I'm going to have a look at is the Viltrox. Now, this is the second cheapest. Now, keep in mind, this is actually a 25mm lens, not a 23mm lens. And to be honest, I actually prefer the 25mm focal length over the 23. This is a 37.5 full frame field of view equivalent instead of a 35. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but 40 is one of my favorites and 35 is one of my least favorites. And this gets me kind of halfway there. So I was more comfortable in general shooting at this focal length. But once again, this is completely personal preference. But for me, the 25 is a little bit of a positive tick for this lens. The other thing about it is the autofocus, once again, is good in photo, usable in video, but slightly imperfect. It is a plastic build, which you might see as a negative, but this also makes it the smallest and the lightest, which is actually an advantage. The other thing is the sharpness and clinical image quality out of this lens is very, very similar to the Sigma. And this lens is about 30% of the price. So if you are price conscious and you are looking for a clinical performance, then I think this Viltrox might be the lens for you. Finally, let's have a look at the Sigma. Now, big advantage to the Sigma. It is an f1.4 rather than f1.7 or f1.8. This is going to allow more light in. This is going to allow you to get a blurrier background. These are definitely advantages to this lens. So this is not an even playing field. These are not f1.4 lenses, these other two. The other thing is it is definitely the best built of them. It is also the largest and the heaviest. It has the best flare performance, a very clinical flare performance. It comes with Sigma's warranty, which depending on what country you are in, is anywhere between 2 and 4 years. It has the best autofocus performance of all the three, and noticeably so. The other ones are good. This one is great. So this is absolutely the best lens. There's no question about that. The question is this lens 4 to 5 times better than the other two because it's 4 to 5 times the price? And my answer to that is no, absolutely not, unless the fastest autofocus and most reliable autofocus performance are absolutely critical, and the just good autofocus performance of the other two isn't enough. Now, the Sigma 23mm is only one of the lenses that Viltrox and TTArtisan are coming for that market share, and I've just thrown a video on screen now. These are two 35mm lenses by TTArtisan and Viltrox, and they are going straight after Sigma's 30mm lens.